and this happened when I was in graduate school, I had a lot of bad habits. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day, and I drank a lot. I came from this little town in northern Alberta, and like many little towns, especially in northern Canada, the alcohol overuse is de rigueur, and so I noticed when I was in my early 20s that the only time I really regretted what I had done was when I was drinking. Now, it was also interfering with me writing because I couldn't concentrate well enough if I was hungover, but I also couldn't really I couldn't tolerate the emotional strain of what I was writing about when I was hungover. It was I couldn't handle being on the edge because I destabilized my nervous system. In any case, I stopped drinking. And the reason for that was, I decided I didn't want to be ashamed of what I was doing anymore. I thought, maybe I could not do things that were shameful and then see what my life was like. So that was sort of on the negative end, the constraint end. I think people get, on the more positive end, people get deeply involved in what they're doing if they're in the right place in the right time. So that I would say you can tell, this is the idea of heaven on earth to some degree. When time stops, when you're not aware of the duration of time, when you're so engaged with what you're doing that you're not aware of the duration of time, then you've got the forces of chaos and order balanced properly. You're not stultified and bored. That's an excess of order. Everything's too predictable. You're not overwhelmed. You're dealing with, you're playing tennis at the peak of your game. That's partly what people experience when they're great athletes, when they play.
The zone, yeah.
And they're always stretching themselves to their limit. You can tell that if you watch a gymnast, for example, who has a brilliant performance. They've stretched themselves beyond their domain of competence during the performance. And that's what makes everybody leap to their feet. That's the incarnation given embodiment right there in front of you for some moments. And everyone cheers that on. Well, it requires even to some degree some good fortune to maintain. I certainly haven't been able to do that while I was ill. And time, one of the consequences of my illness, whatever it was or is, was time dilation. Like days lasted weeks. It seemed like minutes lasted hours. And I mean that literally. And that was terrible. The weight of time. It's the weight of brute mortality. It's the weight of self-consciousness. And you escape that immersed properly. So, and that second chapter is a pretty practical chapter. It's like, well, if you're not who you want to be, then think about how you could be better. Take a chance, aim at that, work at it, and see what happens. So that's a disciplinary routine, I would say.
Yeah, and
it takes you out of your current order.
I think that's also, it's a perfect segue to chapter 3, which is do not hide unwanted things in the fog, which seems to me we live in a constant state of distraction now. You've mentioned Twitter a couple of times. It's like, is Twitter bringing any of us happiness, or is it keeping us all in a constant state of fog? The overload and the endless obsession with politics, that all seems like a fog to me. I do my August off the grid, and I do that. Yeah. I do that to get out of the fog.
Distraction is definitely fog. And you'll distract yourself. I think you distract yourself mostly when your conscience is bothering you, because you don't want to face what it is in your life that is uncomfortable. That chapter is again quite practical. It's a reminder to pay attention often to negative emotion, resentment and that sort of thing, because it can tell you, well, resentment is very useful. Maybe your partner is talking to someone and they're a little bit more animated than you'd like, and you get jealous, and that jealousy is associated with a whole set of insecurities. Or maybe they're flirting and they shouldn't be. It's not that easy to determine, and maybe you'll have a big fight about that, but you could just as well pretend that didn't happen. The emotion comes up. I'm jealous. I'm resentful. It's associated with experiences like that in the past. The psychoanalysts would have called that a complex. You could notice that. You could think, well, should I be jealous? There's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with my partner, or there's something wrong with the relationship. And you have to untangle that. And who knows what you'll have to untangle to get that straight. Or you can bear the jealousy and see what will happen in the relationship. Or maybe it'll disintegrate because your partner is flirting and you ignore that. It's not like you repress it exactly. Mm-hmm. And this chapter is an attempt to distinguish repression from this hiding in the fog. It's that you get a hint that something's wrong. And then you have to unpack that hint to pull the information out. So maybe your partner is flirting and they shouldn't be. And so then you have to find out why they're dissatisfied with the relationship, or what's tempting them, or what is crooked in their soul at the moment, or what they're dissatisfied about. Terrible journey of exploration and discovery. That's always presented as something that's positive. It's often not at all. It's so hard. It's like doing surgery on a suppurating wound. It's no wonder people avoid it. Mm-hmm. But it's not helpful. Because all it does is leave that those things grow and multiply in the dark. And if you ignore them, they just cascade. Do you think
that's just self-protection for most people? That most people, they see it, they know that truth behind them, whether it's about their partner or whatever it might be, but it's just self-protection. Like, I just got to keep moving on as things are. That we're just creatures of habit. Or something like that.
Well, sometimes it's that, and it especially gets to be that if it's accumulated for a long time, because if you wouldn't deal with it when it was a kitten, you're not going to deal with it when it's a full-grown lion.
Yeah.
And so, but I think mostly it's something else I return to in the book is it's deceit, resentment, and arrogance. I already know what I need to know. That's arrogance. Deceit is, I don't have to pay attention to that. And resentment is, well, things can go to hell, and so can he or she. And that's a pretty dark triad. And you don't want the spirit that embodies that to take over your life. That's for sure. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey, man, step in at your workplace, in your family. And you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. Like Abraham, one of the biblical stories, Abraham, he stays in his father's tent till he's like 80, and then God gets fed up and tells him to get the hell out and grow up, and everything that he encounters is catastrophic. He encounters tyranny. The Egyptians conspire to steal his wife. He encounters starvation and war. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world and you think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility. But I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. Remember what happens in Pinocchio. Pinocchio goes to Pleasure Island, and Pleasure Island is a place where impulsive pleasures can be had at a moment's notice. But what Pinocchio discovers, along with Jiminy Cricket, that Pleasure Island is run by masked totalitarians. They're all dressed in black, you remember, and they're turning the children and adolescents who are on Pleasure Island They're depriving them of their voice, turning them into braying jackasses, and preparing to sell them as slaves to the salt mines. And so there's an implication in that story that the pursuit of impulsive pleasure is one route to totalitarianism and slavery, and I believe that. So perhaps orienting your language towards the gathering of impulsive pleasure is a misuse of your highest gift, the gift of logos, the gift of communication. The alternative is to orient yourself towards the highest good, as we already described, and then speak the truth. And you can tell when you're doing that, or you can tell when you're not doing that, because if you're not telling the truth, if you're using someone else's words, you're being manipulated in a sense by forces that are behind the scenes. Not using your own words, you're the puppet of an ideology or another thinker or your own impulsive desires. And you can tell when you're speaking like that because it makes you feel weak. It makes you feel weak and ashamed, and you can localize that feeling physiologically. If you listen to yourself talk, you can tell when you're speaking properly, you will experience a feeling of integration and strength, and when you're speaking in a deceitful or manipulative manner, you'll feel that you're starting to come apart at the seams. And what you need to do is practice only saying things that make you feel stronger. And that'll mean, to begin with, that you'll notice that almost everything you say is a lie. It's either a lie or someone else's words. It's very hard to find your own words, but you don't actually exist until you have your own words. So then you try to teach yourself how to speak your own truth, and you listen to other people while you're doing that, because they can help you shape and correct your words. They'll react to them badly if you formulate your ideas badly, and if you listen and pay attention, then you can learn to formulate your words more and more clearly and accurately, and that makes you more and more powerful. It gives you more and more authority, which is the beneficial form of power. Okay, so you do that, and then you have to make a decision of faith, and that's basically, that you can either use your language to manipulate the world and make it do what you want, or you can use your language to try to articulate the truth as carefully as you possibly can, and then you can see what happens. You have to let go of your desire for the consequences that you want. You have to assume that if you speak the truth, the results are the best that is possible under the circumstances. And so it's an exciting way of living in some sense. It's like continually walking off a cliff, because you don't know what's going to happen next if all you do is say what you think. And maybe you're at work and you say what you think and you get fired, and you think, oh my God, that's a terrible catastrophe. But maybe it's not, because maybe if you're working somewhere and you have to lie to maintain your job, maybe you shouldn't be there. Maybe it's deadening your soul and damaging you in some permanent manner and making you corrupt. And so you have to orient yourself. You have to speak the truth as carefully as you can. You have to listen to others so that you correct your speech. And then you have to allow the consequences that ensue to unfold as they will. That's the ultimate act of faith, I would say. Then you should educate yourself. And it's not that easy to do now, because you have to find people who can actually tell you mostly what to read, and maybe also how to write, because writing is a way of formulating your thoughts ever more precisely. That's why you go to university, to learn how to write. If you know how to write, you can think. If you can think and speak and communicate in writing, you're unbelievably powerful in the authority manner, because arguments move the world forward, and if your arguments are tight and well constructed and lucid and well edited and carefully thought through, and you have 5 rationales for everything that you're doing, which is what happens if you learn to write properly, then you're like a force of nature, man. No one can take you down. And that's one of the things that people aren't taught about why you go get educated, especially in the humanities. Humanities education, if it's real, organizes your psyche, grounds you, puts you on a rock, and makes you a force to contend with. But you have to read the right people. And those are the great, they're the great people of the past. In my list, they're the great men of the past, and that's just how it is. And so here's who I would recommend. I put reading lists up at jordanbpeterson.com. There's 2 of them. And the people that I recommend primarily are their books written by the following list of people: Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, who I think perhaps the greatest novelist the world has ever seen, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another great Russian novelist. I don't know what it is about the Russians, but man, they produce writers that are incomparable. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, where he analyzed the Soviet prison camp system that arose after the Leninist revolution in the second decade of the 20th century, and details absolutely precisely how the tenets of Marxism the Marxist tenets that are supposed to free everyone and change the world, produced legislation that was absolutely murderous in its consequences. And Solzhenitsyn painstakingly traces the logical pathway from the original Marxist principles to the legislation, to the genocides. Because you'll hear people who are basically Marxists say things like, well, true Marxism never existed. And Solzhenitsyn took that argument apart in the mid-70s, and the Gulag Archipelago was an intellectual bomb. It demolished any credibility that Marxism had to intellectual respectability. You have to read the book. The book is about the central issue in our culture at the moment. If you don't read it, you're not informed. You can't participate in the debate except as a puppet. And so I wouldn't recommend participating in this debate as a puppet, because you don't know who's behind the scenes pulling the strings. If you remember the Pinocchio story, the forces that were pulling the strings were not forces that were acting in Pinocchio's best interest, that's for sure. George Orwell, English essayist, incomparable commentator on socialist totalitarianism, even though he was a left-winger and a brilliant one. Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, had some very brilliant things to say about the potential demolition of sexual choice, of sexual partner as a part of a dystopian future. Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who described himself as someone who thought with a hammer. And Nietzsche is a very, very dangerous person and an absolutely brilliant writer. And Carl Jung, who was a student of Nietzsche, and who Nietzsche was the philosopher who had announced the death of God back in the late 1800s, and Jung spent his whole life attempting to revivify God. That's one way of thinking about it. And so if you educate yourself, and this is a really good place to start, if you read these authors, then you'll know what else to read. If you read these authors, it'll take you a good long time, and it will be very, very hard on you, and you won't be the same person when you come out, and that's very frightening. And because being torn down and rebuilt is no joke, but it beats the hell out of the alternative, which is just to stagnate and stay a stagnant infant, which is not something I recommend. There's nothing uglier than a stagnant 40-year-old infant. So that's equivalent, just so you know, to Pinocchio. Back to the Pinocchio story, rescuing Geppetto from the underworld. Remember when he had kind of turned into a half jackass after being at Pleasure Island, where he was enticed, by the way, from a couple of people that was the fox and the cat, who attempted to entice himself into believing that he was a victim and needed a vacation. So Pinocchio was enticed onto Pleasure Island by two figures that played on his sense of victimization and neurosis and suffering to convince him that he didn't have to take any responsibility for his own existence, and he could just busy himself with impulsive pleasures, right? That's how he fell into the hands of the totalitarians on Pleasure Island. Anyways, Pinocchio, after he left Pleasure Island, had to go into the ocean twice, and the second time he went into the ocean, he was looking for his father. Well, everyone's father, from a mythological perspective, is dying in the underworld, in the chaos, because everyone inhabits a culture that's sick and old, so to speak. And it's sick and old because it was made by the dead, and the living have to revivify it continually in order for it to be a dynamic force. And the living have to revivify their connection with the culture internally too, because you're constructions of culture, although not only constructions of culture. And you have to understand history, because otherwise you can't understand yourself. You're a historical creature. And so you have to rescue your dead father from the belly of the beast, from the dragon. Because remember, the whale in Pinocchio is also a fire-breathing dragon. And that means you have to face the thing that you most fear. And when you do that, you'll rescue your father from the underworld. You have to revivify your father before you can become real. And that's part of the problem with the feminist and social justice warrior insistence on the existence of the patriarchy. It's like everyone's known since the beginning of time that culture is corrupt and tyrannical, but it's also protective and benevolent. Even the language you use is a product of culture. And so you don't overthrow the patriarchy, you revivify your culture. And you do that by adopting responsibility for your own being and then acting as a moral agent in the culture. That's what you do to become educated. So read these books. Read these books. They'll change your life. I guarantee it. They'll change your life. They'll take you apart. They'll devastate you. And then they'll rebuild you into something far greater than you are now.
Generally, if I engage in conflict, the reason I engage in it is because I think the alternative is worse. And so, if you're trying to settle things with a family member, there's often a terrible minefield that you have to wander through to reach anything approximating a lasting peace. And avoiding it doesn't make it better. And it's terrible to confront it, and it can be virtually beyond your capacity to tolerate to do it. And so people avoid it very frequently, but that doesn't make peace. It just harbors underground resentment and breeds bitterness and hatred. And so that's not, unless that's what you want, that's not a good solution.
Why do you think it is that some of the things that you've said and the way you've gone about kind of writing up your stuff has been such a phenomenon and caused so many people to sit up and pay attention?
Well, I suppose in some sense those things that we take for granted we regard as obvious, but if we take them for granted and we regard them as obvious, and then they're challenged, we often have no idea why they're valuable. You know, so for example, I've had many clients who were considering getting married or not getting married, and they would say to me, well, it's just a piece of paper. And they thought that was a pretty good argument. And that's not a good argument at all. That's an argument that's so shallow that you hardly know where to begin. But, you know, if someone comes up to you on the street and says, defend marriage, it's like, well, what do you know? It's like, how are you going to do that? It's so obvious that it's defensible that you don't have the arguments at hand. I mean, you know, you're not a legal philosopher. And so people who do that, they think they're intelligent because they can put you on the spot. And merely the mere fact that you can't articulate a claim you share with almost everyone in some traditional sense doesn't mean either that you're stupid or that the principle itself is invalid. It just means that we tend not to discuss all those things we agree upon. It doesn't mean we're without merit. So the rules, I mean, I've been criticized, my books have been criticized, well, they're, you know, self-help, and I think, well, I'm actually not contemptuous of that, so that criticism doesn't bother me. My clinical practice, many of my clients were brought to whatever philosophical understanding they had through so-called self-help books, and if they were reading books, you know, that's not so bad. And what were they trying to do, improve themselves? I mean, how pathetic is that? And then to pander to an audience that needs self-improvement. You know, it's like, well, so yes, the rules were obvious, but the reasons for them weren't. And so I think the reason the books were popular, one of the reasons, is that I tried to make a case for why these hypothetically simple, axiomatic, propositional statements were neither simple nor obvious, and why they were also necessary. And people like to be walked through the whole process of the thought that underlies the claim, let's say. It's very difficult to properly organize your immediate environment. And that's another thing I try to do with the books, is show that some of these so-called simple things, clean your room. It's like, I'll tell you, this is the truth. I've been trying to organize my office for 3 years. I was flooded by so much mail and so much catastrophe that I fell way behind in my ability to keep my closet organized, my clothes organized. I had 3 years worth of mail sitting in my office at the university, thousands of pieces of mail, and it took a lot of work and it's still not done. I hope I'll have my damn room clean by the time I go out on tour, which is going to happen we go back on the road on 25th of January. And I'm hoping, for symbolic purposes, among other reasons, to have my house in order and beautified again as well. But I like to show that simple things aren't so simple, especially if you try them. You know, I had one client, his mother had died, and there was a large family, and the family kind of fell into disorder after she died because it was all boys, it was all sons and a father. And no one had really picked up the maternal role, you know, the necessary stereotypical maternal role. And he decided he was going to try to do that. And man, you know, his brothers and his father, they weren't happy when he first went to get groceries. You know, they felt that he was kind of trying to take the place of the mother. So there was all that grief that was still there. And then who the hell did he think he was? And et cetera, et cetera. I mean, people's houses aren't in order because that's really hard. It's really hard. And it causes a lot of chaos and strife to try to do it. And so Usually it isn't done, and it isn't until you actually try it, like right down to the detail, that you start to understand how difficult it is, and then also how to appreciate. You also start to appreciate how necessary it is. So it's fun shedding light on that sort of thing, and the non-triviality of the ordinary. And part of the reason I concentrate on the individual is because I don't think the things we do are trivial. If you think the things you do are trivial, then you're either bringing a trivial attitude towards them, or you're doing things that you're not doing the things you should be doing, or you're not framing the situation appropriately. So, and you might dispute that, and that's okay, you could, but one thing that my depressive clients, for example, would say, I can't really figure out why anything is worth doing if we're all going to die in the end. It's like, it's fair enough. But I said, I think it was last night at my lecture, I said, if a baby's crying in front of you and you know it's cold or hungry, you don't cease to attend to its distress because the sun is going to envelop the earth in 4 billion years. You think, that's not a good excuse. Well, why not? Why not use that time frame? And your instinctive answer is, well, that's just not the appropriate time frame. And so I would say, well, if you have the habit, the habitual inclination to apply to your own life a time frame or an evaluative framework that reduces what you're doing to meaninglessness, then you should consider whether or not you're using the wrong time frame. Right? If it all of a sudden becomes meaningless, pointless, you're suffering in the work you have to do, well, find a time frame that is appropriate, sufficient unto the day, let's say. That's a good start.
The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. And maybe so others don't have to either. It's something like that. Like there's a real injunction at the bottom of it. It's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. Now, and you could say, well, I don't care about that, but that's actually not true. You actually do care about that, because if you're in pain, you will care about it. And so you do care about it, even if it's just that negative way, It's very rare that you can find someone who's in excruciating pain who would ever say, well, it would be no better if I was out of this. Sort of pain is one of those things that brings the idea that it would be better if it didn't exist along with it. It's incontrovertible. So you get your act together so that there isn't any more stupid pain around you than necessary. Well, so then the question might be, well, how would you go about getting your act together? And the answer to that, and this is a phenomenological idea too, it's something like, look around for something that bothers you and see if you can fix it. So now you think, well, let's say you go into you can do this in a room. It's quite fun to do it just when you're sitting in a room, like a room, maybe your bedroom. You can sit there and just sort of meditate on it and think, okay, if I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command, it's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that you like, there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe little order there would be a good thing, and there's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And like if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. And I might say, well, if you were coming to see me for psychotherapy, the easiest thing for us to do first would just be to get you to organize your room. You think, well, is that psychotherapy? And the answer is, well, it depends on how you conceive the limits of your being. And I would say, start where you can start. If something announces itself to you, which is a strange way of thinking about it, as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different.